Start this webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar on taking action on FERC Order 1920, where we'll be focused on transmission planning and cost allocation. So this webinar is being offered by the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office, together with NARUC and NASIO, and a number of national laboratories. And so we're happy that you've joined us today. All right, so in terms of our agenda, we're going to start with a welcome and some overview and introductions. And then we'll move to Amy Rose presenting a high-level overview of FERC Order 1920. Then Rich Glick will present on where and how states can plug into FERC Order 1920. Then Lisa Schwartz from Lawrence Berkeley Labs is going to lead a panel on state experiences by region. And we've got some great panelists from around the country to present on activities around the country, different states' perspectives and regional perspectives. Then we'll have a deep dive into pre-compliance activities, and we're pleased to have Hannes Pfeifenberger from the Brattle Group to present on the cost allocation, and then Rob Gramlich from Grid Strategies will present on the evaluation process and selection criteria. And then we'll close with some feedback and some next steps. So with that, we will go ahead and dive in, and I'll turn it over to Aaron Smith, who's a project manager in the transmission division at DOE's Grid Deployment Office.
Awesome. Thanks, Juliet. Appreciate the introduction. Hi, everyone. As Juliet just provided an overview, my name is Aaron Smith. I'm a project manager in the transmission division here at the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office. We can move to the next slide. So had I been working at DOE 10 years ago, I'd be talking a lot today about all of the R&D investments that DOE is making and the impact that they would be having decades down the line. And while DOE still makes critical investments in R&D, talking to you now in 2024 and nearly 2025, with the infusion of funds from the bill and IRA bills, DOE has an increased focus on the deployment of energy infrastructure in the near term. The Grid Deployment Office in particular is focused on deployment of grid infrastructure, as the name suggests, and we're overall hoping to get more out of our existing and future system. And one of the ways we do that, and what I'll focus on today in my remarks, is the last bucket you see listed here, and that's providing technical assistance. We can go to the next slide. As you're all aware, FERC Order 1920 placed new requirements on regional transmission planning entities to conduct long-term and more comprehensive regional transmission planning. Order 1920 also expanded the role of state entities in informing long-term regional transmission planning processes in several ways. Some of these ways are limited to the pre-compliance filing process, which is before transmission providers must submit their compliance filings to FERC, and other processes are ongoing and part of the implementation of some of these new requirements. And us here at GDO have worked with our partners at the national labs, NARUC and NASIO to devise several broad categories of technical assistance to meet the key needs across these implementation phases. Ultimately, we want to be partners with you on solving some of these critical infrastructure challenges. Go to the next slide. With recognition that states and planning entities have distinct needs and timelines relative to compliance with FERC Order 1920, GDO has developed two distinct tracks of technical assistance to meet these needs. The first you see listed here is assistance for states, which we just announced yesterday and which I'm going to focus on discussing today. GDO is funding technical assistance offered in partnership with our DOE lab partners, and states can apply through the state TA program. Eligible entities include individuals or groups of relevant state entities as described in FERC Order 1920, as well as other state entities that are permitted by Order 1920 to participate in a state agreement process with the assent of relevant state entities. Ultimately, we hope these offerings will empower states to leverage their increased role in long-term transmission planning that FERC Order 1920 afforded them. The second track that you see listed here, and that I'll touch on more lightly today, is technical assistance for utilities and regional planners. GDO is currently funding rolling TA on Order 1920 for entities who need immediate support, and those entities may apply through the Utility and Grid Operator TA program. GDO anticipates announcing additional targeted offerings for these groups in 2025, so stay tuned. We can go to the next slide. So diving in a little deeper to some of the specific offerings we've developed for states with our partners, we wanted to focus on some of the buckets we developed within the 4 key categories of TA that I just described in a previous slide. So I want to highlight that GDO will fund conventional services that are typically offered under the state TA program, such as help desk, expert match, and deep dive, as well as additional services that are not typically offered under the state TA program, such as national workshops, including the one that we're about to launch today, as well as peer sharing cohorts. And all of these are related to preparing states to address long-term planning considerations under Order 1920. As is evident, today's National Education Workshop is the first TA service GDO is funding under this program. And our partners at the labs, NARUC and NASIO, have organized some great presentations today that we hope will position states to take advantage of near-term opportunities to participate in some of these long-term regional planning processes. With FERC's order on rehearing that was issued just 2 weeks ago, the compliance deadline may be extended for up to 6 months in planning regions for which states request an extension of the engagement window. As such, the time is ripe for you as state entities to consider the next steps. And we hope today's workshop and the above offerings, or the offerings I just walked through, will support you in charting out what those steps look like. I also want to emphasize that GDO funds are designed to be flexible to meet the needs of states. And so states are encouraged to reach out to GDO directly if the offerings described on the previous page do not meet your needs, as GDO may accommodate a variety of technical assistance activities related to FERC Order 1920. Can go to the next slide. I'll touch lightly on this just to keep folks aware. So just highlighting for folks that are either utilities or planning entities, GDO is currently funding rolling TA on a variety of topics that you can see listed here, all primarily related to sort of the long-term planning requirements and scenarios and sensitivities under Order 1920. Similar to the state TA, these offerings should be considered broad, that can be tailored to address a specific need, and planning entities who need support are encouraged to apply via the utility and grid operator TA program. And my final slide today is to just keep those planning entities and utilities a reminder that more targeted offerings to come on our end in 2025, similar to how we have these tailored offerings for states through the state TA program that I've just walked through. Additional offerings will be expected in 2025. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Juliet. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Erin. And now I'd like to introduce Deborah Reynolds from the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Juliet, and thank you, Erin. We certainly couldn't do this without the support of the Department of Energy and the Grid Deployment Office. NARUC, of course, has been involved in many of these technical assistance type programs, and we intend to continue to do so. My name is Deborah Reynolds, and I am the Senior Regulatory Policy Specialist at NARUC, and I am focusing on transmission. And so if you have questions or specific areas of interest, you are certainly welcome to contact me. I'll put my contact information in the chat. Anyhow, I just wanted to thank all of our speakers today. We have a great lineup ahead of us, and I'd like to ask Catherine Reed to come on and say a few words about the National Association of State Energy Officials.
Yes, hi, thank you, Deborah, and thanks to all of you. My name is Catherine Reed. As Deborah said, I'm a Senior Program Director with the National Association of State Energy Officials, also known as NASIO. And most of you know this, we're a national nonprofit that supports all 56 state and territory energy offices throughout the US. So I just want to also just extend my thanks on behalf of NASIO. We're so pleased to be collaborating with all of our partners to offer this training to all of you today. And we're also thrilled to be able to benefit from the support and the deep subject matter expertise from all of our partners, from the Grid Deployment Office, from PNNL, LBNL, NREL, Argonne National Lab, and NARUC. So we are so pleased to be able to work together on this. Thanks also to the great lineup of speakers that we have for sharing your time and expertise. And also thanks to all the participants for taking a chunk out of a Friday to spend with us on this topic. I'll just close with a note saying that this is not a one and done effort on that we're going to be engaged with NASIO. Over the next year, due to the significance of our nation's electrical grid and all the issues that it faces, we're planning to continue to provide support, resources, and technical assistance to our members on transmission planning, such as this, and also related topics on grid resilience, distribution planning, innovative grid technologies and siting solutions, and working with NARUC on comprehensive electricity planning for load growth. I know that's a mouthful, but I just want you all to know that we're going to be very active in this space in particular because of the increasing needs. So the best way to keep abreast of all that we have planned, both at NASIO and also in collaboration with our partners, is to check out our website, or as Deborah offered as well, to reach out to one of us directly, and we'll be happy to talk with you more about those opportunities. So excited to kick this off, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to Juliet to kick off our training. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you, Deborah and Aaron. Okay, just a few logistics. So this meeting is being recorded and it will be shared on our project website. You're welcome to use the comments or the Q&A feature to ask questions in the chat. We'll have a few sections of this webinar that'll be focused on Q&A. And so you can, I believe, you can raise your hand at that time or just put your questions into the chat, and we'll take as many as we can. Just a disclaimer here, it is not the purpose of this meeting to come to any group position or consensus. And once again, I'd like to thank the DOE Grid Deployment Office, NARUC, and NASIO, and the national lab partners listed here. So with that, before we jump in, I just want to take a second. We're going to enter our first poll here. So invite you to go ahead and fill out this poll. We just want to get a sense of where folks are at when it comes to FERC Order 1920. And then we're going to do a second poll that's on FERC Order 1928. Oh, good, they're all together here. So if you could just go ahead and take a moment and indicate that, what is your level of familiarity? I imagine we have some folks on this call who've heard about FERC Order 1920, but don't really know a lot about it. And we probably have folks on this call who know quite a bit about it and have looked into it a lot. And so we are hopeful that we have content that'll be helpful for all of you, no matter where you are and your level of familiarity. So just take another moment here to make sure we get everybody. Jessica, and I also want to thank Jessica Diaz from NARUC, who's been helping with the registration and all the logistics. Jessica, how are we looking? You think we're good to end this poll?
Yes, I'll go ahead and end it and share.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Okay, so it looks like most say they know some, but not a lot. With a few say they know quite a bit, and on FERC Order 1920A, know very little, and some, but not a lot. Okay, excellent. Thank you all so much. Well, with that, I'm pleased to turn the time over to Amy Rose, who's Transmission Group Manager at NREL. So take it away, Amy.
All right, thank you very much, Juliet, and good morning, everyone. So I have been tasked to set the stage for today with an overview of FERC Order 1920, which means I'll be trying to distill over 2,000 pages of regulatory documents into 10 minutes. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the next slide. The primary motivation for this order was a view by the Commission that Order 1000 and other previous orders were not working to enable regional transmission planning and the necessary regional transmission investments that this planning would lead to. Specifically, the Commission cited that the majority of current transmission planning was happening outside of regional processes through generator interconnection or local projects. And there was a real lack of transparency in many regions, particularly outside of the RTOs and ISOs, as to how they conduct their regional planning. And then state participation in the process was often lacking, with some regions not really having a mechanism through which states could provide input. So to remedy this, Order 1920 was issued in May of this year, and after rehearing and clarification request, Order 1920A was issued last month. And together, these introduce 6 major requirements for transmission providers. The first is that it requires transmission providers to engage in regional long-term transmission planning to identify transmission needs. Second, they must develop evaluation processes and selection criteria for selecting transmission facilities to resolve those needs. Third, they must evaluate transmission facilities that will address interconnection-related transmission needs. Fourth, they must consider alternative technologies to just building transmission, including advanced conductors, power flow control devices, dynamic line ratings, and transmission switching for both new and existing facilities. Fifth, transmission providers need to also consider local planning and right-size replacements for transmission facilities in their planning process. And then finally, they must develop a default or a backstop cost allocation method, and then a process for voluntary funding opportunities and state agreement. So I'll briefly touch on each of these to give you a sense of what the requirements are. Starting with the next slide, with the requirement to conduct long-term regional planning. So here the commission outlined a number of specific requirements that they felt were needed to ensure long-term comprehensive planning takes place. And this includes a requirement that transmission providers develop at least 3 plausible and distinct long-term scenarios to represent how the systems may evolve over time, each with a planning horizon of at least 20 years. And these will also include a sensitivity applied to each scenario to represent an extreme event. And these long-term scenarios need to be updated at least every 5 years. And importantly, stakeholders need to have an opportunity to be involved in the scenario design. And to ensure the planning process considers all the potential drivers for transmission needs, the commission specified 7 specific factors that need to be incorporated into the long-term scenarios, and those are listed here. So each long-term scenario must incorporate the first 3 factors, and I won't go into these in detail here, but the first 3 need to be incorporated, and then there's some latitude as to how they consider the last 4, including the option to provide some discounting of these factors. And importantly, states have an important role to play here in the design of the scenarios. So I've highlighted factors 1, 2, 3, and 7 here on this slide. Looks like the formatting got messed up a little bit here, but you can still see them. Where the order requires transmission providers to incorporate input from states as to how to reflect state plans to meet laws, policies, regulations in their long-term scenarios. Let's go on to the next slide. The next big aspect is the requirement to establish an evaluation process and selection criteria so that the long-term planning outcomes are not just for informational purposes, but they could actually lead to some project selection. So to address failures in what the commission saw in the current rules to require transmission provider that didn't require transmission providers to consider a broad range of benefits, this rule now established a set of 7 required benefits that need to be evaluated for transmission facilities under each scenario. I'm not going to walk through each of these in detail in the interest of time, but I will note that in general, with few exceptions, like in the case of MISO, for example, many regions have historically just focused on this 3rd benefit or trying to quantify production cost savings. So this requirement that now requires looking beyond just production cost savings can really mark a departure from the way project evaluation is currently done in many regions. And within this requirement for evaluation and selection criteria, transmission providers need to measure the benefits for candidate projects or portfolios of projects. They need to designate a point in the planning process when selection decisions will be made, and they need to share the outcomes of selection decisions with stakeholders. This evaluation process and the selection criteria need to be developed with input from relevant state entities. So this is another role for states to be involved. And it must also include a process for voluntary funding opportunities, meaning if there's a project that doesn't meet the selection criteria, relevant state entities and interconnection customers could have an opportunity through which they could voluntarily fund all or part of the cost of that project to help it get over the line to meet the selection criteria. And then finally, the evaluation process needs to also include a process and criteria to reevaluate projects that were previously selected in cases where circumstances have changed. For example, project costs have increased and the project is no longer the most cost-effective or efficient. So the order discusses some criteria for triggering reevaluation. Let's go on to the next slide. The next requirement is related to considering interconnection transmission needs. And this is really intended to address barriers to integrating new resources that might not otherwise be built because of interconnection constraints. So the focus here is on transmission upgrades that have a demonstrated need, but are likely not being developed because of transmission project cost. And this is really intended to be kind of a near-term issue that's part of existing transmission planning processes, with a view that in the future, transmission needs associated with interconnection are going to be captured by some of the factor categories that go into the long-term scenarios in the new process. And so the commission provided 5 criteria to specify what constitutes a demonstrated need, including requirements that these need to be projects that were identified in at least the last 2 planning cycles over the previous 7 years. And they need to be projects that are not going forward because the underlying interconnection request has been withdrawn and there's no current plans or agreements in place to build them. Next slide, please. The next big topic in the order is on the consideration of alternative technologies to meet transmission needs. And the driver here was to force the investigation as to whether some of these alternative solutions could be more cost-effective than just a transmission-only solution, either by adding them to existing facilities or by making them part of new projects. Ultimately, the order requires consideration of 4 technologies, including dynamic line ratings, transmission switching, advanced power flow controllers, and advanced conductors. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into much detail on these, but happy to discuss it further if there are any questions. Next slide. The next requirement covers consideration of local transmission planning in the regional planning process, and this was really driven by 2 considerations. First, there's a desire to increase the transparency and the assumptions and information that are being used for local planning, because this information really forms the basis and the foundation for regional planning. And so 1920 introduced some new requirements to share information with stakeholders and provide opportunities for feedback and questions through a series of 3 public meetings to go over first, the assumptions that go into the planning study, second, the transmission needs identified through the study, and then third, the transmission solutions identified to meet those needs. The other consideration in local planning is recognition that the majority of transmission facilities in many regions are reaching or have already passed the end of their operating lifetimes. And so in addition to transmission investments to expand the existing network, there's a huge need to replace transmission facilities that are already in service, and an opportunity to evaluate, could these facilities be right-sized or replaced with larger facilities that could be more efficiently or cost-effectively address long-term needs. So 1920 requires transmission providers to set out a process through which they would evaluate opportunities to right-size replacements, including those listed here. So they'd need to establish a voltage threshold, propose a timeline when candidates for right-size replacement could be put forward, and then evaluate and post which projects could make sense for right-sizing. Notably, right-size replacements are eligible for federal rights of first refusal, so incumbents could still have the opportunity to develop these projects before they're open to competition. And the hope here is that this would provide an incentive for transmission owners to put forward their best projects for in-kind replacements to be considered. All right, let's go on. So finally comes the always contentious topic of cost allocation, or who has to pay for projects selected through the regional process. So I spoke briefly about the requirement for voluntary funding opportunities for projects that don't meet the selection criteria. The other 2 options for cost allocation, first, there's a requirement to file 1 or more ex-ante cost allocation methods that would apply to all selected facilities. So this method, also referred to as a backstop method, needs to follow all of the cost allocation principles from Order 1000, except for Principle 6. So you can no longer have different cost allocation methods based on different types of projects. The second optional method is through a state agreement process through which relevant state entities could voluntarily agree to a cost allocation method for a single project or a portfolio of projects. So transmission providers need to provide a 6-month engagement period for states to negotiate a state agreement process. And with 1920A, there's now an option to request up to an additional 6 months from FERC to continue those negotiations. And while transmission providers aren't required to propose a method agreed to by states during the engagement period, Order 1920A does require them to include as an attachment any method that states agree to, along with their compliance filings. Next slide. And with that, thank you very much. I know this was a bit of a whirlwind tour, but we have a good lineup of speakers to follow who will be able to dig in a bit deeper to these topics. Thank you.
Perfect, Amy. Thank you very much. You're right on time. Okay, now we're pleased to turn it over next to Richard Glick from GQS New Energy Strategies. Rich is the former FERC chair, or former FERC chair, excuse me. And I also learned recently that Rich was the person who originally filed the ANOPR that ultimately led to the FERC Order 1920 that we have today. So we're pleased to have Rich presenting to us today, specifically on how states can plug in and going a little bit deeper. So Rich, turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Juliet, and thanks very much for inviting me to participate today. As Juliet mentioned, I was at FERC when the Commission issued both the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking as well as a notice of proposed rulemaking that eventually led to Order 1920. And I think there was a recognition during that time that the transmission planning process wasn't working very well, but there was also a recognition that the states weren't necessarily in most regions sufficiently engaged in the regional transmission planning process, and certainly engaged in the allocation of the cost associated with transmission. So the 1920 and 1920A, which we'll get into, really there's a lot of effort, a lot of focus from FERC on trying to increase the role of the states, because in matter of fact, even though FERC has a lot of jurisdiction over both regional transmission planning and cost allocation, in reality, if the states don't buy in, especially on the cost allocation side, it'll be very difficult to actually build the projects that are very much needed. Next slide, please. So FERC in Order 1920 really created what was really historically unprecedented in terms of the role for states in this process, and as Amy just mentioned, primarily through the state engagement process, and I'll spend a little minute or two on that, and then we'll move on to what 1928 says about the state engagement process. Essentially, FERC created this process where relevant state entities are defined as both state utility regulators, but also state agencies that have siting responsibility. In some states, that's the same agency. In some states, it's different agencies. Some states, it's the state energy offices, the NASIO members. In some states, it's actually totally different than the NASIO members. And so it's just the way the Commission defined it is you have to be either a utility regulator or a siting agency to be considered a relevant state entity, and you would be participating in the state engagement process. And it requires essentially the transmission providers, the transmission utilities in each region to facilitate this engagement process, which has already begun actually, because prior to issuance of Order 1920A, the compliance deadline was June 12th, and since it's a 6-month process, and the utilities in each region wanted to get the engagement process done before the compliance filings were due, I think all the regions have had at least an initial meeting to discuss how the engagement process might work. And essentially, as Amy mentioned, there's really the engagement process is really focused on 2 areas for the most part. One of which, and both having to do with cost allocation, which is by far the most controversial issue when it comes to transmission development, and in many cases, probably the largest barrier to transmission development is a lot of people want transmission. How you actually allocate the cost between states, between customers it's often very controversial. So the state engagement process gave the states an opportunity to develop both the ex ante cost allocation methodology, the backstop cost allocation approach that Amy mentioned a couple minutes ago, as well as a state agreement approach, which is really, for the most part, aimed at ex post cost allocation. So you would have a cost allocation methodology on file, transmission projects. That would be the ex ante methodology. Transmission projects would be selected, and unless there was something else in place, that particular methodology would then apply to the transmission projects that are selected. The differences on the state agreement approach, state agreement process, is that presumably transmission projects are identified, transmission projects are actually selected to move forward. The states would have a period of time in which to come up with a different allocation methodology if they can agree. And there's actually examples of that, particularly in the MISO regional transmission organization region. The states on 2 different occasions now have really worked very hard in coming up with a different cost allocation approach to two large tranches of transmission projects that were selected through the MISO transmission planning process. Interestingly enough, the states would actually have to decide what agreement means. So, for instance, do all the states in the region have to agree on the methodology? Is it a majority vote? Is it some sort of weighted vote? Is it dependent on the population of each state? There's a whole variety of factors you could look at, but the states among themselves in each region will determine what an agreement means. And under Order 1920, if they come up with an agreement on an ex-ante cost allocation methodology or an agreement on a process for a state agreement, and I'll get into a process in a couple minutes, then under 1920, the utilities would then have to decide whether to file what the states agreed on with FERC or not. FERC would review, if it is filed with FERC would review whether that was reasonable or not. But again, the utilities didn't have to file those agreements, which was somewhat controversial. The utilities would choose to file. As I mentioned, they would have an opportunity to file, but they wouldn't have to, and that's something 1920A addresses, and I'll get to that in a second. There are other opportunities for state involvement up front before the utilities submit their compliance filings, one of which is the selection criteria that Amy talked about, the transmission selection criteria. The utilities are required to get the feedback of the states in this process. Now, what was interesting about the order itself, there were 3 commissioners voting at the time. 2 voted for it, Commissioner Clements and Chairman Phillips. 1 commissioner, Commissioner Christie, voted no. Some of you probably know Commissioner Christie. Used to be a Virginia State Corporation Commissioner, very interested in states having an important role in cost allocation and other matters as well that are pending before the commission. And he dissented in large part because he didn't believe that Order 1920 gave the states a sufficient role. And then we saw several states a sufficient role, particularly in developing the cost allocation approaches and having more of an input into the final decision as to how you allocate costs associated with the selected transmission project. Several states also appealed on the very same grounds, and those appeals are pending before the courts. Next slide, please. So recognizing that there was still a sufficient amount of controversy after Order 1920 was issued, especially as it related to state support, FERC took those concerns to heart and just a few weeks ago issued Order 1920A, which is a rehearing order on Order 1920, and made a number of changes really aimed at, for the most part, most of the changes were aimed at addressing some of the concerns that the states have raised and hopefully bringing more state support for the process itself. So first of all, many states had concerns that the 6 months that the states were given for the state engagement process was not sufficient amount of time to do the work which was required or which was at least allowed for in the state engagement process relating to cost allocation methodologies and so on. Those are very technical and it's hard to get that done in 6 months. So FERC said if the states want, they can ask for another 6 months. FERC will grant the additional 6 months, and that would also delay the compliance deadline for the utilities in that particular planning region in which the states make the request. And then I mentioned earlier that the utilities could choose to file the ex-ante cost allocation and the state agreement proposals that the states put together, but they didn't have to. Now FERC is saying no, they have to submit it. Utilities can submit their own proposals. The states can submit their proposals, and FERC would decide to choose one or the other, whether the state proposals are better, whether the FERC proposal, whether the utility proposal is better, or FERC could decide that neither of them are good and impose their own approach. But at least we know that what the states come up with, if there's an agreement, it will now be before FERC. And then it also said you can't just provide a forum for the utilities to sit down and for the states to sit down and discuss this matter. You actually have to you have to actively engage with the states, provide information, and have a dialogue back and forth. In addition to that, it basically there are the potential changes in the future. The commission said if actually utilities in the future want to change their cost allocation methodology that FERC's already approved, they would go in and file a request with FERC. They have to consult with the states first before doing that. And then there's Amy talked a little bit about planning the scenario development and the different scenarios that have to be considered as part of the planning process. And there's a greater role for the states, particularly as it relates to the state rules, state regulations, state laws, and how that impacts planning. The utilities, the states essentially have to be consulted to a great extent before the utilities develop their planning scenarios for the different planning regions. All these changes and a couple more, I think, hit the mark in many ways. I think the most notable issue is that Commissioner Christie voted yes. There are now 5 commissioners. 1 didn't vote, 4 voted, and all 4 voted yes. And Commissioner Christie supported. I think we'll have to see. The appeals are still pending. We'll have to see if the states decide to drop their appeals or not. There'll still be other appeals pending, even if the states drop their appeals. But I think overall, the reaction has been relatively positive from the states, what we've heard so far. Next slide, please. So from on a going forward basis, the states have a number of questions they have to consider as the relevant state entities as they're engaging in the state engagement processes around the country in the particular regions. As I mentioned before, the regions have already convened these meetings, and I think all the regions have convened at least one meeting with their relevant state entities. First of all, the states have to decide whether to seek a 6-month extension. I find it hard to believe the states in the region aren't going to ask for the 6 months, but nonetheless, they have to make that decision. And then they have to decide, do they want to actually pursue their own ex-ante cost allocation methodology? I mentioned it's pretty complicated. It can be difficult to agree, especially in regions where you have a lot of states. To get agreement, however you define agreement among the states on a methodology, even in a year's time might be difficult. But nonetheless, there's an extra 6 months than there was before to do that. And so I think the states the regional state entities in particular need to sit down and decide, do they want to work on their own methodology? Do they want to try to just influence what the utilities file? And that'll be one of the decision points. On the state agreement process, and I'll get to that more in a minute, but they have to decide whether they want to propose a process for how they're going to pursue a state agreement approach later on. That's one of the decisions they have to make initially during this state engagement process. And then the relevant state entities have to figure out what an agreement, as I mentioned earlier, what is agreement, and that's not necessarily easy to do, especially again in regions with a lot of different states, and they'll have to figure that out before they even decide to pursue the cost allocation methodologies. And then there's been a number of requests by other stakeholders. Can they participate in these meetings? Can they sit in? Can they observe? Can they provide some sort of input to the relevant state entities as they pursue the state engagement process? And so and FERC left it up to the relevant state entities to decide who they want to have sit in the room. But as it comes to decision making, it's just limited to the state agencies that make up relevant state entities. And then as it relates to the utilities are going to be submitting their compliance proposals, which will cover a whole bunch of other issues in terms of not only how they select transmission, how they're going to develop the scenarios, how they're going to pursue transmission planning, regional transmission planning in the future. And the states have to ask themselves how much they want to engage with the utilities. That's not necessarily, many of those issues aren't necessarily required. The utilities aren't necessarily required to consult with the states in any great manner, at least in some of those matters. But the utilities need to decide, do they want the utilities to come? The states need to decide whether they want the utilities to come to them with their proposals before they send it off to FERC, and maybe so they can provide some input on that. So next slide, please. So that's really the questions that the states have to consider. I want to point out what I think is going to be the most relevant point for these state engagement processes, and that is the state agreement process. Now, the state agreement process, as I pointed out earlier, is basically a cost allocation methodology, a cost allocation approach that's applied after the fact. So you have these transmission projects, either portfolio projects or maybe just one project, and the states would decide, do we like the ex-ante cost allocation methodology, or do us states want to get together And we think, well, maybe the benefits are a little different than the ex ante method would suggest, and maybe we want to negotiate our own approach. And so basically, FERC, through the state engagement process, is allowing the states to come up with the process. They don't have to get into any great details about how they're going to allocate the cost, because they don't know which projects are going to be selected in the future. But they actually come up with the process, and that process has to determine, one, how the states are going to, again, reach agreement, not only in terms of developing the process, but when they're going to agree on the cost allocation methodology. Is it going to be majority vote? Is there going to be some other methodology? Who on behalf of the states gets to decide? It doesn't have to be the relevant state entities. For instance, you could say the governors in a particular region have to decide, or just the state regulators or some other entity among the states. But they have to come up with that proposal or that approach when they submit their state agreement process to the commission. And then how long the states will have to reach an agreement. This is an important point, and in large part because it relates to the fact that under Order 1920A, FERC is saying, and under 1920 as well, FERC is saying, if you have a state agreement process, and once the project is selected, you could start the process before the project is selected. Once the project is selected itself, states at most have 6 months. They can decide to do it in a shorter time, but if they want the full 6 months, that's as long as they have. If they don't decide within 6 months or reach agreement within 6 months on a different cost allocation approach for a particular project that's been selected, then that ex ante methodology, which is why it's called the backstop, the ex ante methodology will then apply. And that's important because I think that, again, the states that don't like the ex ante methodology, that will think that methodology will cause them to incur more cost than they think is just with regard to a particular project. They have the incentive to essentially sit down amongst themselves and work out a different approach that hopefully will lead to something that all the states can live with in a particular region. With that, I hope I didn't take too long. I hope there's a little time for questions if anyone has any.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. There are a few questions here, so we may have time for a few more. So if others want to enter questions into the Q&A box, that would be great. All right, the first one here, Rich, is how will 1920A affect pending court cases?
So I think the big issue is the pending case is the appeals that have been filed. Those have all been consolidated in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, and I don't think there's been a timetable yet set for oral argument in that case. I think there'll be a couple issues there. One of which, as I mentioned earlier, are some of the states do they think the 1920A improved the order and caused them to drop out and drop their appeals? That may be the case, but I think there's still going to be some appeals going forward. Some of the state attorney generals around the country, for different reasons other than the cost allocation methodology, appealed the rule, and I suspect that their appeals will continue. So it'll still continue. The appeals will still continue, but I don't want to get into it in any great detail, but there's actually a lot of precedent supporting FERC's authority to pursue what they're pursuing in 1920 and 1920A, and I'm pretty optimistic that the court will uphold the commission's authority in this case too.
Okay. Great. Can just a few RSEs in a large planning region break off from the rest of the states and design their own state agreement process and state agreement method?
So again, FERC didn't put a lot of parameters on if all the states have to agree, if a couple states have to agree. So technically under the rule, you can get, let's say you have 14 states like PJM, 14 states, maybe 5 PJM states decide to pursue a different state agreement approach. I think that they could certainly submit that to FERC. It might be difficult to if a project comes down the pike later on and there's 5 states agree to pay a certain percentage. It doesn't mean the other states are on board with paying the rest of the cost of that project. It's better to try to reach agreement among all the states, but I don't think FERC is prohibiting a portion of the states to come up with their own approach if they want, but it would only apply to, it probably wouldn't apply to all the projects that were selected.
Okay. All right, and then maybe one last question here, and this question came in at the end of Amy's session, but maybe you can help answer this. So when applying cost allocation to all projects equally, does this mean any project that goes through FERC formula rates?
So FERC formula rates covers a whole variety of other projects that are not regionally planned. So 1920 and 1928 only apply to the allocation of costs that are selected as a result of the regional transmission planning process. But there's a whole number of other transmission projects immediate need projects, reliability projects, and so on that are built outside of that often are built outside of the regional planning process. And so those costs are then are recovered through formula rates as well. But presumably, if FERC were to, if there was an ex-ante cost allocation methodology, a project was selected in a particular region, those costs would also be included in formula rates. But again, I want to make the point, formula rates wouldn't just cover this, it covers other transmission as well.
Okay. All right. Well, Rich, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we're going to go ahead and move on now to the panel. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Schwartz from Lawrence Berkeley Labs.
Thanks, Juliet. Now we're going to hear from representatives of regional organizations of states to get an update on their experiences so far, engaging in activities related to FERC Order 1920. We asked them each to respond to 3 questions in 8 minutes. First, what is your region focused on and what's the status? Second, what are your priorities in the pre-compliance phase? And third, what are your greatest concerns? First up, we'll hear from Brad Pope. He's Director of Legal and Regulatory Affairs at the Organization of MISO States. Next up is Ben Sloan, Director of Legal and Regulatory Affairs at the Organization of MISO, at the Organization of PJM States. And then we'll get a perspective from the West, from Robin Arnold, who's Director of State, Federal, and International Affairs at the Western Interstate Energy Board. And finally, we'll hear from Abe Silverman with Silver Green Energy Consulting, representing Northeast states. We'll have time for Q&A following everyone's presentation, so after Abe's presentation. All right, let's start with Brad.
Thank you, Lisa and Juliet. Hello, all. I had the unenviable task of trying to follow former Chair Glick, but I'll do my best. Thank you for inviting OMS to be part of this excellent seminar, and thanks to the DOE's Grid Deployment Office for their work supporting states to grapple with Order 1920. As we've already heard, Order 1920 prescribes a significant role for states in regional transmission planning and cost allocation, and Order 1928 further solidified and expanded that role. Now, as you know, former FERC Chair Glick noted, Order 1920 incorporated many of MISO's current planning practices into the requirements that it established for all Order 1000 planning regions. So my goal today is to impart a few lessons learned and best practices from OMS's experience in the MISO region, and less on the specific directives of the order. Throughout my quick discussion here, I hope to answer the 3 questions that were identified by Lisa at the start. We can go to the next slide, please. So a quick background on OMS. We're an association of 17 state and utility commissions within the 15-state MISO footprint, reflected there on the map on the right. But we also have 14 associate members, including state consumer advocates and energy offices. So I know we're amongst friends here. We can go to the next slide, please. So over OMS's 21-year history, we've actively participated in several major regional transmission planning efforts. While the MISO footprint today extends down to Louisiana, all of these transmission portfolios have been planned for and built in the MISO North Central region. You can see those on the maps on the screen. And you can also see that the success begets success, as these portfolios have more or less doubled in cost in each iteration. And we're on the precipice of MISO's board approving $21 billion in transmission for tranche 2.1 of MISO's long-range transmission plan. And whether there's an appetite for doubling that cost to continue will be interesting to see unfold. We can go to the next slide. So how are these portfolios developed? Well, MISO, with the input from states and stakeholders, conducts top-down regional transmission planning to identify specific transmission lines that qualify as multi-value projects, or MVPs. MVPs are developed to meet multiple drivers such as economics, public policy, and system reliability needs. Now, during the multi-year study process that identifies these projects, MISO and stakeholders rely on scenario-based planning to identify a least regret portfolio of projects. Now, this scenario-based planning is one of the hallmarks of Order 1920 and has been really crucial for states and stakeholders to have comfort with kind of that least regrets solution that is ultimately proposed. Now, states and the utilities that they oversee are closely involved in the scenario building process. We submit inputs on load growth, resource expansion, announced and expected retirements, and state policy goals. These state policy goals and utility goals really drive, to a large part, the development of the futures that MISO bases its ultimate portfolio around. And there is a component of model building there through sophisticated transmission planning software, which is also based on current federal incentives, decarbonization targets, and various subsidies that are in place. So as you can expect, some of the finer details of those futures does get a little controversial, but ultimately having the range and the bookend of futures provides a measure of comfort when the ultimate business case comes out for a specific portfolio. Now, we've been living through this experience over the last 3 years or so, and as I noted on Thursday, MISO's board will consider approving Tranche 2.1. This consists of 24 projects at a cost of $21 billion, and it's designed to serve as a 765 kV backbone for the system. There are a lot of questions, a lot of folks that think maybe this didn't even go far enough. So we, at OMS, really serve to educate our members on some of the specific issues and the objectives of this portfolio, and don't ultimately, render an opinion on whether or not it should be approved or not. That is ultimately left to the individual states when the specific projects go before them in certificates of need proceedings, or in many cases, specific proposed routing decisions. We can go into the next slide and take a few steps back, just looking at the lead up to MISO's LRTP initiative, which kicked off around 3 or 4 years ago. OMS began discussing the needs and priorities and the roles of its members and what they wanted out of this LRTP initiative. As proposed by MISO initially, LRTP was to be divided into 4 different tranches or ultimately portfolios. They've approved Tranche 1, and that's going through the state approval process and competitive bidding where appropriate. And as we discussed, Tranche 2.1 has been under consideration for a few years now and is close to the finish line, at least in the RTO process. But leading up to that, OMS really wanted to get some guidance and provide some outward visibility of what our positions were, and that led to the approval of a 2019 position statement on long-range planning. And in that position statement, we noted, that overall the organization supports regional coordinated planning, but we really prescribed OMS in the states having a leadership role, being in the driver's seat of this scenario and portfolio development, and of course, cost allocation. But we'll save that for a moment. The position statement also discussed a consideration of non-transmission solutions like grid enhancing technologies, and that remains a priority of our organization as we come to terms with these big bills for major transmission construction, just ensuring that we're making the best use of the current system that we've already invested in. And so any discussion of transmission, of course, can't occur without discussing how it's paid for, which is the fun part. To that end, OMS created the Cost Allocation Principles Committee, or CAPCOM, in 2020. And CAPCOM is essentially comprised of all of our 17 board members, but it's a specific place where we can educate each other on various cost allocation methods around the country, consider new ones, and just examine, how we can be nimble and flexible given the changing resource mix and a variety of, extreme weather scenarios that are playing out. So after a series of discussions and in this research, CAPCOM approved specific cost allocation principles for LRTP projects in 2021. Just running through at a high level, those principles noted that benefit metrics should be quantifiable, replicable, and forward-looking. They also noted that load and generators could be cost causers or beneficiaries of projects, and that cost allocation must be fixed at the time of project approval. Notably, there was also a principle or within the cost allocation committee that considered a reflection of a sub-regional approach. And this ultimately led to MISO filing what's known as the sub-regional postage stamp cost allocation method. And that was approved by FERC in 2022 and really is where we're at today. This essentially provides a postage stamp or an MVP energy usage rate to allocate costs within the MISO North and South region, and then separately within the MISO North and Central region, and then also within the MISO South region. And in that FERC order, I think there was a concurrence from Commissioner Christie, who noted that he encouraged MISO to explore more granular cost allocation methods. And to that end, we kicked off in 22 a second phase to examine generator pays frameworks and a variety of granular methods. Ultimately, these discussions kind of resulted in maintaining the status quo, and MISO South, through its Intergy Regional States Committee, is considering developing a separate cost allocation method just for those 4 states. So we mentioned the futures development process, and just want to reiterate how critical that is to states. Really, you need to be involved early and often in this process, and I think that's reflected in Order 1920. A specific role for states is prescribed, but during MISO's futures creation process, states were actively involved, and I think it resulted in upwards of 200 or 300 changes to specific siting locations for future generation. We also, offered many of the results from integrated resource plans, as well as state laws and goals that had been passed. So I think that's, one area where states can really ensure that their voice is heard and that any ultimate portfolio reflects the needs and ultimately desires.
Brad, you're over time. I recommend you go to the next slide and then just quickly focus on the MISO items at the bottom and then wrap. Thank you.
Absolutely. Sorry. Yeah, so on to the next slide. I just wanted to know where we're at in the process. Order 1920A, of course, expanded the roles of relevant state entities, and to that end, OMS is considering expanding its cost allocation principles committee to serve as the forum for those relevant state entities in the state engagement period. MISO has requested a 1-year extension of time to comply with Order 1920, and we supported that, really in part because we thought that extra time was crucial to develop the state agreement process that Commissioner Glick mentioned. So, ultimately our biggest concerns that I want to express is, that we're trying to avoid a lack of agreement on a more tailored approach, because, if without that, the default would ultimately go to a decision of the transmission owners in MISO. And, we think it's important for states to be involved early in this process. And happy to take any questions. Sorry, we went a little over time.
Thanks. We're going to save questions for the end after everyone presents. Next up is Ben with the Organization of MISO States.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Ben Sloan.
Meant to say, I'm so sorry.
No worries. Can you hear me? Am I coming through?
Yeah, you sound great.
All right, great. Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about what's going on in PJM. For those who don't know, OPSI is a group of 14 retail electric regulators in the Mid-Atlantic region, which stretches roughly from New Jersey to North Carolina to Chicago and everywhere in between. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so I wanted to kind of tee up kind of the bifurcated compliance obligation structure in PJM. It'll help folks understand kind of how the states are approaching our engagement with 1920. On the left, you'll see PJM has the compliance obligations for many of the long-term planning process compliance obligations in 1920. So that's developing a scenario, a process to develop scenarios, how they use benefit metrics in their long-term planning process, how they identify needs and ultimately select projects. So all of that's in PJM's purview, and a lot of those conversations are going on in a forum called the Transmission Expansion Advisory Committee. And they have a special set of meetings in that forum to discuss all of that work. On the right side, you'll see the transmission owners themselves have the authority under Federal Power Act Section 205 to modify the cost allocation rules in the PJM region. So things related to cost allocation fall within their purview, primarily developing the ex-ante cost allocation method for long-term planning and working with the states on any state agreement process rules that the state entities may want to advance. We're still doing our research on voluntary cost allocation methods, who would make that filing, but I assume PJM, the TOs, and the states would all come together to make sure that that's procedurally sound. But those are the two entities that the states are working with right now. Let's go to the next slide. So on cost allocation specifically, this is where OPSI stood up what we're calling the PJM Area Relevant State Entities Committee, or the PARSEC. The OPSI board stood that up on September 19th, chartered that group, and established its voting procedures. In short, every state in OPSI, including DC, gets a vote. In states where there is a siting authority, then the PUC and that siting authority would split the vote. And this group would be looking for 2/3 support on any proposals that they want to sign on to in order to move that out of the PARSEC process. OPSI members, the 14 retail regulators in the PJM region, are part of PARSEC, as well as a power siting board in Ohio, the Kentucky Electric Generation and Transmission Siting Board, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and the Delaware State Energy Office, because each one of those entities has a role to play when it comes to siting transmission infrastructure. So this group has met with the TOs 3 times over the past few months, kind of getting some education on 1920, talking about existing cost allocation precedents relevant to our discussions, kind of getting the lay of the land of the status quo when it comes to cost allocation, benefit metrics, and selection criteria in PJM, as well as trying to learn what other regions do. So going forward, this group, the PARSEC, working with the TOs, is hoping to wrap up our education at some point in the next month or two and start moving towards developing straw proposals for everybody to discuss. Like Chair Glick had noted, states can request an additional 6 months in their engagement period. So ours is currently set to run from October 7th of this year to April 7th of next year. So if we extended that out, that'd run all the way through October 7th of 2025. Let's go to the next slide. So separately, not related to cost allocation, PJM also has some compliance obligations, like I was noting. They've kind of set up their work in a 3-phase process that's hopefully going to lead to a compliance obligation that considers the feedback from the states, but from stakeholders more generally as well. So in August, they did some education on 1920. They received stakeholder presentations in September on what folks think should be in PJM's 1920 compliance filing. And since October, they've been working to get feedback from the states as they continue to kind of think through at a high level what their compliance may look like. And so in that state outreach, we've stood up some roughly monthly calls with PJM where the retail regulators, the siting authorities, but also other state agencies that are interested in longer-term transmission planning can join this group to react to what PJM's proposing, have a separate forum to provide some feedback to PJM outside of the normal stakeholder process or outside of those special TX sessions to help drive the development of PJM's 1920 compliance proposal. So as was noted earlier, there is an expanded role for the states in developing scenarios now. So we're hoping to get everybody on the same page on what those requirements are actually saying. And perhaps there may be an expanded role for the states to work with PJM, maybe through the Parsec specifically, to develop the scenario process and the scenarios themselves once PJM kicks off the long-term planning process required by 1920. So let's go to my last slide. Wanted to just touch on some of our focus, what we're focusing on, what our priorities are, and some of our concerns. I'll start with concerns. As you can click that link in the yellow orange box there, OPSI did file a motion for clarification and amendment of 1920 on June 12th, stating, we were concerned about the role of the states as described in the initial order, and we asked for that order to be amended to give states a greater role in scenario development, but also to give them a greater role in the cost allocation discussions, i.e. requiring the TOs to file any agreement that the states reach in their discussions. And so FERC did respond to both of those requests. We also asked for amendment to allow PJM to run alternative sensitivity modeling, alternative scenarios, not just to inform its planning, but also to inform cost allocation. And there was a reaction to that in 1928. OPSI asked for some clarification that the existing state agreement approach, which is PJM's primary public policy single driver planning process right now, whether or not that would be affected by 1920. And we did get a response in 1920A as well that the existing state agreement approach is unaffected by 1920, and that it can be used in 1920 compliance filings as long as it meets the applicable cost allocation precedent that we've seen from the courts. And we asked for a couple examples on what might pass muster at FERC and their examples in 1920A. So OPSI is certainly digesting 1920A, but glad to see some engagement with some of our thoughts in our motion for clarification and amendment. Going forward, looking to work with PJM to develop scenarios that they might use in the long-term planning process, as well as putting some guardrails on the process, the scenario development process itself, and ultimately trying to think about how those scenarios might inform our cost allocation discussion, so we can understand, how the benefits that are produced by those projects, how the cost of those should be allocated, recognizing the multiple types of benefits they may provide. So that's all that I've got on my slides. We can go to my last slide. Glad to take any questions now, or if you'd like, you can send me an email later too.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. We're going to move from OPSI to the Western region. So we have Robin Arnold with the Western Interstate Energy Board. Robin?
Hi, thank you. Next slide, please. So the Western Interstate Energy Board, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, originated in the 1970s as the Western Interstate Nuclear Board. All of the governors in the 11 Western states came together and requested that it be created by Congress. Since then, we have expanded to cover electricity issues in the West that require regional coordination. And we help facilitate a number of different committees in the West. The one I'll be talking about the most today is the Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, which consists of one member from each state and 2 Canadian provinces, British Columbia and Alberta, appointed by the governor, primarily from the energy offices, as well as 1 member from each state and province from the Western Commission of Public Service Commissioners. Western Conference of Public Service Commissioners. Since January, this group has formed a sub-working group on transmission called the CREPC Transmission Collaborative. We've been discussing a number of transmission planning issues, including WestTech, the Western Expansion Transmission Coalition, which has been working on a 10-year and 20-year West-wide transmission plan. It's a voluntary effort. There is no cost allocation tied to it, and it is not tied to the 1920 planning that we are discussing today. However, it does cover the entire West, and it includes a variety of stakeholders, including both the FERC jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional transmission providers, merchant developers, independent power producers, states, tribes, public interest organizations, consumer advocates. They really tried to cast a wide net to get as many stakeholders as possible involved. And part of that is because trust has been a real issue in the West. It is hard to work together regionally, so we're hoping that this West Tech effort will really help to build trust in the regional transmission process in the West. As far as FERC Order 1920, first we need to take a step back to FERC Order 1000. There are currently 3 FERC Order 1000 planning regions in the West. CAISO, which covers California and a small portion of Nevada, West Connect, and Northern Grid. These 3 regions decided to keep the same footprints for their FERC Order 1920 planning. As you can see, there is a bit of overlap between the regions. Most of my remarks today will be focused on West Connect and Northern Grid. Unlike CAISO, they have more states that they need to coordinate. They have very little experience with state engagement, and they have never actually identified any projects through the FERC Order 1000 process. So cost allocation has not really been a topic of discussion in those regions. Next slide, please. So when the regions went about trying to begin this process, they first had to identify who the relevant state entities were in each region. They reached out to their FERC jurisdictional transmission providers to identify who the RSEs were. As you can see, there's a much longer list in Northern Grid than there is in West Connect. Both identified Montana and Wyoming as being within their region. However, West Connect only identified the public service commissions, whereas Northern Grid also includes the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, the Wyoming Department of Game and Fish, the Wyoming Governor's Office, and the Wyoming Office of Consumer Advocates. CREPC has been discussing a lot of these issues already. As soon as 1920 came out, we were fortunate enough to work with Gridworks and have Rich Glick come and help us understand all of the different requirements that were in there for state engagement. And so one of the biggest concerns we've had is that given Northern Grid and West Connect's lack of outreach to states in the past, as well as the fact that it's very likely that there could be interregional projects identified through the 1920 process, we wanted to try to coordinate what comes out of Northern Grid and West Connect as much as possible, at least on the state side. And so CREPC is discussing potentially forming an ad hoc 1920 committee that would cover both Northern Grid and West Connect to try to help coordinate what the state agreement process might be in both regions, as well as the ex ante cost allocation methodology. There's a lot of concern that the timeline doesn't really allow for meaningful engagement on the ex ante method, just given how wide the views are in the West. With 1920A, there's a potential to extend the timeline, so there may be more interest in that now that there's more time. However, the primary focus is going to be on that state agreement process and what that process would look like, what voting might actually look like, what does agreement actually mean. So we'll be very focused on that in the next few months. If we do form an ad hoc committee, we would have to reach out to include all of the non-energy offices and or utility regulators who are on this list, as well as Nebraska, South Dakota, and Texas, who are part of West Connect, but are not currently in the CREPC footprint. I'll also note that one of the main concerns in our region is the selection criteria that will be used. Given that we're trying to coordinate the region, so it would be potentially a broader footprint, that would make the selection criteria even more important. So there is a large emphasis on that that has been stated by at least our member states as well. And I will end there and leave it for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Robin. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and I'll track those. But meantime, I have several questions. First, Brad, you said that scenario planning is key. Can you describe what you think are some best practices today for scenario planning for transmission? And Abe, I realize I need to get to you. I just let's go to you, and then we'll go back to Brad. We're going to turn from the west to the northeast states, and Abe Silverman is with Silver Green Energy Consultant, and he's going to speak on behalf of the Northeast States Collaborative on interregional transmission, and then we'll get to the questions that I am so anxious to get to. Abe?
Yeah, I figured you all probably would have had enough slides today, so I decided to go sans slides, but really appreciate the invitation. So as Lisa just mentioned, one of the projects I work on is facilitating this Northeast States Collaborative on interregional transmission. This is a group of 10 states, basically from Maryland up to Maine, along the coast, and then Vermont and Connecticut, Vermont and New Hampshire as non-coastal states as well. And so I sort of come at this from the perspective of looking at 1920 as part of the answer to long-term transmission planning, but only a piece of it. Because, fundamentally, 1920 is about intra-regional, so within ISO or within a particular transmission region planning. And it leaves a lot of questions about what happens as we think about how do we build an optimal transmission system that includes both regional and inter-regional transmission capacity. I think we're going to hear quite a little bit later about a lot of the different studies showing the value of potential inter-regional transmission to improving our reliability, lowering costs, meeting policies better. So I wanted to sort of walk through a few things that we talk about quite a bit, and then also sort of delve into a little bit about what the states can be doing as they get ready for 1920 compliance that sort of goes beyond some of these large discussions that you've heard about today. So one is, I really urge a lot of the states to stop talking about cost allocation and instead start talking about benefits allocation. I certainly saw this. I worked in New Jersey for a while when we would go to the governor and we would talk about cost allocation. The office's eyes glaze over. If we start talking about benefits allocation, that kind of changes the discussion a little bit. So if we're talking, hey, there's $5 billion of benefits to divide up between multiple states, I feel like we really get the attention of politicos who maybe don't follow this stuff as much. And of course, benefits allocation is exactly the same thing as cost allocation. It's just framing it in a more positive way. The second thing I will say is that 1920 is part of the long-term transmission solution, but it's not an exclusive venue for having these discussions. I actually see a lot of value in states getting together and talking about what they can do and what they can promote. And this, it can be projects within a region, that meet local state priorities, or it can be projects where the benefits extend across multiple regions. And I think it's really critical that states don't get so caught up in 1920 that they ignore the ability for them to get together and talk and plan and negotiate and even potentially allocate costs across regional boundaries or across state boundaries. At the end of the day, that's basically what 1920 and particularly 1920A requires anyway. So I think there is a lot to be said for states getting together and identifying candidate projects and pushing them forward. So the other thing I want to talk about real quick is I think there's two really important areas that states need to focus on as they go through this 1920 process. One is transmission provider facing, so FERC facing, a lot of the things you've heard about today. But the other is states should be looking internally to their own policies as well. Because at the end of the day, what 1920 is about is identifying the long-term needs of your state and asking the transmission provider to plan for those. And so I sort of, have a few steps that I would certainly recommend any state do as they start thinking about this holistic evaluation of transmission policy. And, particularly these days with data centers and advanced manufacturing, transmission policy is economic development policy as well. And so if we want good economic development, we really do need good transmission planning. So the first thing I would say is every state really needs to have a good handle on what their existing mandatory policies are. Those get incorporated automatically into the 1920 planning process at the ISOs or at your transmission provider. And like that is absolutely step one. But then step two is equally important, which are what are the policies that your state may have that aren't currently codified, that aren't mandatory and therefore are not required to be in the 1920 process. And I think a lot of states need to sit back, look at the universe of policies and goals and say which of those actually do need to be codified so that they are considered in the 1920 planning process. And then the third piece of that is I would say, in addition to your existing mandatory policies and your goals, you should also be thinking about what are the state's energy and economic development priorities for the future that aren't currently codified in either policy or goal, and think about putting them into place. Because all of a sudden with 1920, we actually have a mechanism where state policy evolution is going to directly tie in and affect ISO RTO transmission planning. And that's a real power. That's an important factor. And for so many states these days, like I said, the economic development as well as clean energy strategies really do require an effective transmission grid. So, we often actually talk about codify. What can you do? Put it into law or statute such that it feeds into the transmission planning process. The second main area that I think we need to talk about is the transmission owner utility ISO RTO compliance filing process. So we've talked a lot about scenario development. We've talked a lot about benefits and inputs, but I think it's also absolutely critical that we talk about the actual compliance mechanism. So we should all be able to answer in the ISO filings, what does it look like when a state wants a transmission policy? How does it get put into the 1920 planning process? How do we make decisions when we come out of the 1920 initial scenario development runs and we get those models out? How do we actually talk about putting those, turning those evaluations and studies into actual results? And one of the things I saw this very clearly in New Jersey when we did a state agreement approach in PJM, which is basically a voluntary Order 1000 type transmission planning exercise, where the tariff, which was written years ago, wasn't that clear about how the process was going to work and what the state's rights were. And I think as we come into the 1920 process, each state should be really working very carefully with the compliance entity to make sure that not only is the scenario development right, but that we have a really clear system of having state priorities considered, and we know how those decisions are going to be made. And cost allocation is absolutely one piece of that, but it is separate and apart from sort of the mechanics of how the tariff works. And I think that is an underappreciated facet of compliance as well. So just as we, just to come in and sort of talk a little bit about some of the other things that I think need to be incorporated into each transmission provider's compliance filing, above and beyond sort of the mandatory pieces that FERC requires, there's a few we've talked about. One is how do you incorporate potential inter-regional transmission projects into your 1920 planning process? 1920, of course, is going to identify mostly intra-regional upgrades, but there are cases where the studies may show that there is a benefit to connecting with your neighboring region, that you can make that connection more cheaply and accomplish the planning goals with less cost. The second piece of that, which is very akin, is how do we think about the resource adequacy benefits that accrue to two regions when they connect? We are not at all consistent nationally in how those resource adequacy benefits are calculated, and it's a major source of value that we need to think about. The third is I would really urge states and ISOs as they come into compliance to pre-negotiate what the threshold for selecting projects is. Now, FERC did not mandate that in 1920. There is nothing in 1920 that comes in and tells a state that they, or tells a transmission provider they have to build a particular project. However, that doesn't stop regions from voluntarily agreeing to do that. I think the MISO process is really a model for this. and the recent ISO New England policy, where they have come in and identified transmission plans and allowed for cost allocation and for construction to begin if it meets a certain cost benefit threshold. Up front, they agreed to that. Those are excellent models for actually getting stuff built at the end of the day. I also think that each of the processes, we need to make sure that they have a role for a state to inject a particular public policy objective into the transmission plan. And I think it would be a real shame at the end of the day if the states give up the power that they have under some circumstances today, though it varies by region, to identify specific transmission needs and instead sort of defer to the larger, to the sort of, the ISO RTO planners without the ability to come in and do that. And then the last thing I'll say is it's really important that we sync up the long-term transmission planning process with the short-term process. 1920 is all about long-term, but you could very easily see, if we don't watch this very closely, that short-term plans are going to basically eliminate or be inconsistent with the long-term plan. And so we need to have a feedback mechanism where the short-term plans and the immediate reliability and economic benefit needs that are determined through the short-term process are incorporated into the long-term process, and that the long-term results influence the short-term results as well. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to questions.
Thanks, Abe. And now, I can ask my first question. Going back to Brad, you said scenario planning is key. So briefly, very briefly, what are a couple of best practices for scenario planning for transmission?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I would really stress and emphasize what Abe said in his presentation. I think he hit it perfectly. But just to add a couple things, I think early in the process, you need to define whose voice will ultimately guide some of those conversations. In MISO, we've had late in the process, the independent market monitor get involved and start questioning some of the future scenarios that have been developed. And there's been some disagreement about how much credibility and weight to give his voice. And then also having clear deadlines and milestones, because these futures could be tinkered over a period of time. And you really need to know what's going to be included and then start planning from there.
Great, thanks. But I'm going to follow up. You mentioned alternative sensitivity requests. Can you say a little bit more? What kind of sensitivities are you talking about?
Yeah, so it would essentially be removing certain types of drivers from the base case or the planning that considers all the categories of factors in 1920 in order to understand and isolate other categories of factors, so you can understand to what extent, public policies or whatever else is driving the need for and the ultimate transmission you identify. So it's really, supposed to help inform cost allocation by accurately separating out the cost of certain drivers.
Great. I'm going to follow up with you and get a quick response to a really hard question. What's the gnarliest cost allocation you've heard so far among states in the PJM region?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff out there from, economic benefits flowing, reliability benefits flowing, combinations of the two, generator pays type cost allocation methods. Folks have thrown it all out, but I don't know if anybody's pushing anything too gnarly at the moment.
All right, great. Well, we're going to go to sort of a rapid Robin here to Robin. You mentioned that Western states are concerned about the selection criteria that will be used. Can you talk about some of the criteria that the states are concerned about?
I'm not sure. So we haven't really gotten into anything too in depth yet. Again, we're still trying to just organize state discussions. So I wouldn't point to any specific criteria. However, just in general, I think there needs to be trust and acceptance that the projects actually being selected are ones that are beneficial to the region. Otherwise, the cost allocation methodology becomes much more difficult as well. Trying to get people to agree on how to allocate costs is based on assuming that everybody agrees with the benefit, the selection criteria in the first place.
Great. And then I'm going to turn to Abe in our last minute or two. You talked about the importance of states looking to their own policies, including economic development policies. So that makes me think of state energy offices. what do you see as the role of state energy offices in this process?
Oh yeah, yeah. They're absolutely critical to everything. And you know, I think the best states are the ones where the State Energy Office and the Public Service Commission are singing in harmony. You know, you really do need to understand not just what your existing statutes say, but really what is your holistic, you know, what are your holistic needs? How much electricity do you expect to be using? I mean, you know, Rob Gramlich's going to be talking earlier. His wonderful report, "The Era of Flat Load Growth is Over," you know, really categorizes what we're expecting to see in load growth over the next few years, and it's eye-popping. And some of that is attributable to clean energy policies like EVs and building electrification. But the vast majority of it is coming from economic development objectives, largely around data centers and advanced manufacturing, though not exclusively. So I think, you know, having worked in New Jersey is one of those unique states where the State Energy Office and the Public Service Commission are actually the same entity. We would look at these, you know, we would look at questions from developers trying to locate new facilities, both generation facilities and load consuming facilities in the state. And, you know, we would have to say, well, sorry, the utility can't accommodate you for 8 years. And that is obviously a completely unacceptable answer. And so I think part of what 1920 and some of this holistic transmission planning, you know, initiatives coming out of FERC allows the state to do is identify, we think there's going to be intensive generation or load growth in a particular zone, in a particular geographic area. Let's make sure that we are planning for that in our long-term transmission planning process. And so we just need to make sure that states are feeding in both sort of their existing statutes, but also making sure that their goals are codified in a way that they can be considered in the 1920 process.
I want to take a minute to have you focus on the role of utility regulators who, you know, want to reserve some of their judgment for particular cost allocation cases that may come before them.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, I'm often reminded that it's at the end of the day, it's all about comedy between states and agreeing on a least regret strategy. And, you know, I think just MISO has really shown the way in the ability to get a bunch of states to sit down together, identify a suite of projects that on a portfolio basis benefits everyone. And that discussion hasn't so much happened in a lot of other regions. And you know, I'm most familiar with PJM these days, but obviously it's something that affects other parts of the country as well. But I really, you know, I think that the change in transmission needs over the last few years, where we really are starting to see economic development driving massive transmission builds, means that, you know, I think we're sort of breaking out of this blue states are in favor of transmission, red states are opposed to transmission paradigm that we found ourselves in the last couple of years, particularly in the PJM footprint. And now everybody is going to be looking and saying, okay, we're going to need all this new transmission coming in. How do we talk about doing it more cost effectively? And I'm just reminded when PJM did a study that looked at building transmission sufficient to meet every state RPS and clean energy goal, they came up with something like $3 billion of transmission investment, which, I mean, it's a lot of money, but that is so insanely cheap. And it just shows the power of coordinated transmission planning where you're looking across an entire region. There's no reason to think that the same kind of savings wouldn't apply if we did, regional studies for load growth as well. And so I think part of this is building that coalition of red state, blue state, coming together to just do these least regrets types of processes, you know, in a just vastly more cost-effective manner.
Thank you. Your presentations were all excellent. Thanks so much. And I'll turn this back now to Juliet.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you to all those panelists. That was fantastic. And we're doing pretty well on time. We're doing pretty good on time here. So that's awesome. All right. Pleased to now turn things over to Hannes Pfeifenberger, who's a principal at the Brattle Group. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper now on cost allocation. And so Hannes is going to share his own slides here. So go ahead and pull those up.
Did that work?
Yeah, you just want to go into slideshow mode. There we go.
Right. How's that?
All right, looks great.
Well, thank you for having me. So we're gonna go into a little bit of detail here to talk about cost allocation, which is sort of the thorniest part of it. It's easy to plan a transmission project, but ultimately somebody has to pay for it. So what does it all mean? As we've heard before, Order 1920, as clarified with 1928, provides specific cost allocation provisions. One is that the transmission providers with the states have to come up with a default methodology for cost allocation of regional transmission projects coming out of this long-term planning process. So the transmission owners have to engage with the states over 6 to 12 months to come up with a default methodology. The proposed allocations of that default methodology must be roughly equal with estimated benefits. They don't have to be matching the benefits. They don't have to be formulaically based on benefits. And these default allocations cannot be based on project types. So there cannot be different allocation for reliability projects or economic projects or public policy projects. And Order 1920A, which gave a lot more say to the states, also requires that transmission owners must involve the states in any future changes to cost allocations. And if they file their own cost allocations that differ from what the states have proposed, transmission providers have to file with FERC both the states and the transmission owners' proposals. In addition to the default methodology, there's the opportunity for states to have a state agreement process, which gives states the opportunity to be involved in the project development, project selection process, but certainly within 6 months of a project selection, they can propose an alternative cost allocation. And that creates a lot of flexibility on the process, the requirements, but if no cost allocation agreement is reached, the default allocation would be used. I also want to point out that there are voluntary funding opportunities under which states or any interconnection customers can voluntarily fund a transmission project or a portion of the transmission project that otherwise would not meet the planning entity's selection criteria. This is a very interesting aspect because if there's an attractive project from a state's perspective, which could include an interregional project, that might be one way to go about that. So agreeing on cost allocation is critical, it is challenging, and it is possible. We have some good examples. It's easiest, of course, to agree on cost allocation if it doesn't involve cost sharing, if the project costs are just collected from the customers of the region of the local transmission owners. It's harder when you regionally share the cost of reliability projects, but reliability is so important that cost sharing gets a little bit easier. But policy states are still reluctant to share in the cost of very distant projects where it's not obvious how that project in New Jersey provides reliability benefits to Illinois or things like that. It is much harder for economic or public policy projects simply because our perspective of what the future looks like will differ. There are some states who are looking at a clean energy future. There are some states who are looking at advanced manufacturing and data centers, and the transmission that benefits one state or that has benefits that one state values are not necessarily the type of benefits that another state values. So there's also reluctance to pay for transmission that facilitates out-of-state generation investments with few in-state jobs. So from an economic development perspective, it's something. It used to be hard for Massachusetts to pay for transmission in Maine if that means Maine gets all the jobs for, the transmission construction or, generation. That has changed quite a bit over the years, but that's the sort of challenges that we have seen. And it's hardest by far to do cost allocation for interregional projects. That's just because we don't have any models or experience, because basically no interregional transmission project has been planned as a regulated project. There's some merchant projects, but no regulated interregional projects in the last decade or so. So what do cost allocation approaches look like? Well, the most commonly used approach is what we call the license plate approach, where each utility, each transmission owner locally recovers from its customers the cost of its transmission facilities. MISO is doing most of that for all of its reliability projects, and it's usually used for all of the local projects that are really planned by the local utility anyway. We got beneficiary pays approaches, various formulas. It doesn't necessarily have to be a monetary dollar benefit. It could be a benefit as captured, for example, in a power flow analysis. Costs are allocated based on some metric of beneficiaries to transmission owners, and the transmission owners then recovers those costs from its customers through a license plate tariff. Then we have this thing called postage stamps. These are broad regional, uniform regional cost allocations where, just like a postage stamp, it doesn't matter whether you send mail in state or out of state, you pay the same thing. There are a bunch of such as examples of region-wide postage stamp. ERCOT, Texas, for example, has a single charge for transmission in the entire state. California has it for transmission above 200 kilovolts. ISO New England has it above 100 kilovolts, and MISO has it for what they call the multi-value projects. SPP, very interesting, has a combination of postage stamp and license plates, where a postage stamp is regionally allocated for all projects above 300 kV, and low voltage levels have increasing shares, 1/3, 2/3 allocated regionally versus locally. And of course, these postage stamps can be implemented in different ways. Some of them apply on a peak load megawatt perspective, others are on a megawatt hour perspective, but often costs get allocated to TOs who then recover it through their license plate tariffs. There's direct assignment participant funding, where transmission costs are allocated to requesting entities. That's often used for generating interconnection or long-term transmission service requests. There's some very innovative approaches, such as the CalISO's HGP project that has upfront funding for a large transmission build that later gets charged back to generators. We got merchant cost recovery, where the project sponsor recovers all its costs or most of its costs from individual long-term transmission service customers outside regulated tariffs or using the negotiated rates. And then, of course, and this is often overlooked, there's the co-ownership opportunity. In other words, several transmission owners who benefit from a large new facilities may co-own that facility. Each recovers the cost of its ownership through base rate treatment. There will be one operator, shared transmission rates. In the Midwest, there's this, in Minnesota, there's this CapEx 2020 transmission or portfolio of transmission projects that uses this. It's often frequently used in the West. So let's talk about a couple of recommendations. From our perspective, we really recommend a two-step approach. The first step, which should be to figure out, is a project beneficial? Before even thinking about cost allocation, we want to find some really valuable projects. Calculating the benefits can be challenging, and what you see in the green chart, the benefits that can easily be quantified may be short of project costs. So one needs to make the extra effort to quantify the benefits that may be more difficult to quantify to really see that this is a valuable project. And we really want to avoid understating benefits, because then you might end up rejecting even valuable projects simply because you're not counting or considering some of the benefits. It's also harder to figure out how these benefits accrue to individual market participants. So if you go too quickly to a market participant perspective, it makes it much harder to see the total project benefits. And then the second step would be build a portfolio of projects that are individually beneficial and only allocate the cost of the whole set of portfolios. As we see on the next slide, this really reduces conflict. It makes it much easier, and we get a more uniformly distributed benefit picture as well. So why does portfolio-based allocation offer such significant advantage over project-specific allocations? And let me just say, Orders 1000 and 1920 do not require that the cost of each project is allocated precisely based on its benefits, as long as the cost allocation of the portfolio of projects is roughly commensurate with the overall benefits received. So even postage stamp allocation is appropriate and applicable if all customers tend to benefit in the region, and the distribution of benefit is likely to average out across the region or over the life of facilities. Portfolio-based allocations are less controversial and easier to implement because portfolio-wide benefits tend to be more evenly distributed and more stable over time. And we only need one allocation for one analysis for cost allocation for the entire portfolio, versus if you do it for every project, you might have 20 projects and you have to have different cost allocations for every one of those 20 projects, which can be a nightmare. So portfolio makes it much easier. And the examples, of course, are the S&P Highway Byway and Meister MVP, where benefit cost analyses are actually performed, and I'll show you some examples. I also strongly recommend to allocate costs in a way that's roughly commensurate with, but not formulaically based on quantified benefits. Cost allocations that are formulaically based on quantified benefits are inherently contentious and I find counterproductive. And that is because the quantified value of benefit metrics depends on the analytical approach and assumptions. For everyone to agree on the same approach and assumptions is very hard. And the benefits also vary across scenarios, and they can quickly change as current or projected market conditions change. This gets you into a situation where you say, well, should we base allocation based on this scenario or that scenario? Or, in 3 months, the gas prices change and all the benefits move around. And if market participants question the benefit metrics and approaches and assumptions that yield large allocations to them, you end up in a situation where everybody wants to understate one or the other one of the benefits. And this ends up yielding very conservative understated benefit metrics, such that even the most valuable transmission projects have quantified benefits that are so understated that they can't meet their own benefit cost thresholds. Formulaic benefit allocations for individual projects are even more contentious and can yield unexpected outcomes because the benefits and the utilization of transmission projects changes very quickly over time. Add a new data center and all the transmission flows change and benefits change. Retire a generating unit, add a new unit, add a new transmission line, change in fuel costs. It becomes a very difficult calculation that people would want to update every time things change, and it's hard to get to a common agreement. We've also seen in PJM that allocations based on benefit metrics that seem perfectly plausible, like power flow, can create some really unexpected and contentious outcomes. So strong recommendations to do cost allocations that are roughly commensurate based on a broad set of benefit quantified for an entire portfolio of transmission projects. And here's an example. MISO's multi-value projects, they use a sub-regional postage stamp. Sub-regional, it only applies in this case to MISO's Midwest region, but not the South region. And MISO quantifies, a half a dozen transmission benefits. And what you see in the bar chart is the benefit cost ratio of a portfolio that's about $6 billion worth of transmission that was approved back in 2011. And the different colors of the chart shows how the benefits have changed over time, first quantified in 2011, then updated in 2014, then updated in 2017. So what we see here is that the benefit cost ratio for the individual zones, 7 of them in the Midwest, they're not identical and they're not constant over time. These things move around. But you also see that every zone receives benefits that that exceeds allocated cost everywhere. The benefit cost ratios move around a bit, but they all are highly beneficial for each zone, with benefit cost ratios ranging anywhere from 1.5 to 3.2. We have the same example in SBP, where SBP, the Regional State Committee, created the highway byway approach. And they agreed that every 3 years, at least initially, SBP would calculate the benefit to make sure that each zone in fact benefits with a highway byway cost allocation. And what SBP has found that as you quantify more of the benefits, the cost savings that transmission provides, it actually averages out quite well. There was 1 or 2 zones that didn't receive benefits that exceeded allocated costs, but SVP had a specific mechanism to address that imbalance for the zones that didn't see quite the same level of benefits. I also want to remind you that OMS, more than a decade ago, has worked with MISO to evaluate cost allocation alternatives. And OMS back then proposed that MISO use for the multi-value projects an injection withdrawal approach, where costs are allocated both to generators and loads based on differences in local and regional transmission rates. That OMS proposal was ultimately not filed by MISO. MISO ultimately filed the postage stamp. But it is a very interesting concept that OMS has developed then. So where does it leave us? Let's make sure we realize Order 1920 creates a unique opportunity to focus planning less on near-term reliability and local needs, because it proactively allows us to plan grid infrastructure that provides greater flexibility and higher long-term value at lower system-wide costs. That means we need to recognize every transmission project offers multiple values, that the lowest cost transmission is not necessarily the least cost from a customer perspective. Sometimes you have to pay money to save money, and transmission is one of those. And these lower cost or higher value transmission solutions facilitate cost allocations by reducing total customer costs. So we need to make sure we improve benefit cost analysis to yield more cost-effective and less controversial outcomes. We need to quantify a broader range of cost savings facilitated by transmission to address reliability, economic, and public policy need comprehensively. There's a lot of experience out there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel either in cost allocation or in benefits calculation. We know a lot about how to do that better. And to reduce the divisiveness of cost allocation, we need to understand the benefits better. We need to focus on larger portfolios of transmission projects and recognize that, the range of benefits for a larger portfolio will also be more stable over time. Again, I would say allocations should be roughly commensurate, but not formulaically based on quantified benefits. And for your reading pleasure, I'll leave you with many more slides, but let me stop here. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hannes. That was fantastic. All right, we've got a few questions here. The first one is, how do you monetize the difficult to quantify benefits category?
Well, the easy to quantify benefits are those benefits where you can run a simple model and the model immediately spits out the results. The more more difficult to quantify benefits are usually the ones that require a little bit more thinking and different way to use the tools. It often requires that you clearly identify, what a benefit is by looking at the difference between a base case and a change case. It might require that you model extreme weather events and see what the benefit of transmission is during extreme weather events, which is not usually done. The production costs model that typically are used to calculate production costs, for example, they're weather normalized models. They don't have any transmission outages and only a very modest amount of generation outages. Now, we wouldn't need much of a transmission infrastructure if the weather was always normal and we didn't have transmission outages. So the harder to quantify benefits require that we explicitly model these challenging events, for example. And then on resource adequacy, that doesn't come out of a production cost model. We actually have to do some resource adequacy modeling to quantify those benefits. So those are some examples. It just requires us to sharpen our pencils, use our tools a bit differently. But I want to say we have all the tools needed and we know how to quantify the difficult to quantify benefits. It's a little bit more work. Maybe we don't have to quantify it in all instances, but we know how to do that.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, another question here. RTOs and ISO regions have more experience with this. What recommendations do you have for the West to get to what you consider best practice, a portfolio-based approach that focuses on all benefits, including hard to quantify ones?
Yeah, I think anybody who wants to do transmission planning for economic and public policy reasons, transmission planning that's coordinated with integrated resource planning. I mean, some of these benefits that are being quantified in RTOs are actually easier to quantify in the West where you have more vertically integrated utilities, because you might need to quantify that building a transmission line makes lower cost generation resources available to be built. So you can quantify that you save yourself a lot on generation costs by spending more on transmission, or by interconnecting more strongly, say, the Northwest with the Southwest, you create seasonal diversity benefit that reduces each region's resource adequacy requirements. If you want to put a dollar number onto these things, you can use the methodologies that have been developed in the ISOs to quantify these benefits. I don't think there's a difference in how benefits are quantified, whether you're in an ISO or in a non-ISO world. You just need to make sure you look at all the costs and all the moving pieces. Okay.
Another question about kind of like almost a chicken and egg. Does the project come first or the cost allocation come first? And how do you encourage states to consider ex ante cost allocation? Does it need to be around a specific project, or how do those things fit together?
Well, having a default cost allocation, I think, is necessary. And when you put states in charge to come up with a default cost allocation, like the SPP highway-byway methodology, you make it easier to have cost allocations come first. It certainly simplifies the planning process. However, there will always be special transmission projects that don't fit the mold of an ex-ante cost allocation. That's why I think the voluntary funding opportunities that's required in the Order 1920 and the opportunity to create a state agreement process where the states can come together and say, well, this project doesn't fit the default method, but we are willing to have a different cost allocation for those specific projects. So for very unique projects that don't fit the mold of the ex-ante mindset, it's better to do it after the fact, or to have the flexibility to have a different cost allocation after the fact. But to have a process that's workable, you need to have some sort of ex-ante allocation process.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Hannes, and thank you for making your slides available. There's a lot of great resources and information in those slides, so everybody take a look at those when we send the slides out. So thank you, Hannes.
Thank you so much.
All right, so now we're going to transition to our last presenter, and we're really pleased to have Rob Gramlich today, who's president of Grid Strategies, and he's going to be talking about the evaluation process and selection criteria. And Rob, you're going to share your own slides, right?
Yes, I am. Let me give that a try here.
All right.
Thank you, Juliet. This has been a great program so far. Congratulations to everybody who organized it. Oh, let's see. I have to enable my system to. Oh boy, I'm gonna have to quit and reopen to do it. Maybe somebody there should.
Okay, I can do it. We've got your slides here. Let me just pull those up.
Zoom wants me to probably download another version and all that. So we will spare everybody that and go through this. I feel a little bit like the old Mo Udall here in Washington. Everybody has spoken, or sorry, everything has been said, but not everybody has spoken. I will try to be relatively brief to avoid anything I've heard. Great presentations again from everybody so far. But why don't we dive into it? I'm covering kind of the more like the planning side, whereas Hannes was more on the cost allocation deep dive. So I'm going to talk about the scenarios, benefits calculation, and project selection. And we'll go to the next slide. One key point on each of these things, as Hannes said in the context of cost allocation, there's quite a bit of flexibility here, which does point to the important role of states. So transmission providers, of course, have a lot of discretion to use that flexibility, but the states were also given that flexibility. So a role in determining those things. So we'll go through those components here, but just kind of stepping back to a high level, transmission providers are required to identify long-term needs, identify facilities that meet the needs, measure the benefits, and evaluate facilities for potential selection with, again, a fair amount of discretion on each step. The process is structured to analyze whether building certain facilities would yield benefits greater than their costs. And so, there's language throughout the orders, 1920 and 1920A, that sort of indicate classic economic policy, maximize net benefits, but they didn't state that, they didn't require that. Again, they gave some discretion on the exact metrics for selection and the other items. But the commission's goal, as they said, was to get result in rates that are just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory or preferential, and adequately account for changes occurring outside the commission's jurisdiction. And we'll go to the next slide. And by the way, I sent a update. So there's two orders here. There's 1920 and 1920A. The version you're seeing on the screen, generally these paragraph numbers refer to 1920A. I sent an updated presentation and PDF, and so what will be sent around or posted will be a little bit clearer about whether we're referring to 1920 or 1920A. But on the again, the role of the states in these planning items, I think this was said before by Rich, so I won't read this whole thing, but there's a definition of state entities as well as flexibility for how the state entities, the RSCs, make their determination. So FERC's orders are mostly kind of keyed off of the state agreement. When they agree, then it gets plugged in here and here. Well, how do they agree? That's really up for the regions to decide how they agree, which is, by the way, very similar. This construct is not very new. I was working for the FERC chairman in 2003 when the Southwest Power Pool states wanted a very active role in transmission planning and cost allocation, and we at FERC gave them that and allowed the regional state committee to sort of determine how it would make decisions and gave them explicit roles over transmission planning and cost allocation. So this is, I think, based on solid examples over the last 20 years. Next slide. All right, so opportunities for states regarding planning in the compliance process. So states should provide input on the scenarios, benefit methodology, and project selection criteria that the transmission provider files with FERC. And the benefit quantification and project selection to maximize benefits. But again, FERC leaves that up to the regions to determine specifics. One example is a least regrets approach, which you do see sometimes in regional planning. MISO and CapEx prior to that had used sort of a least regrets approach. A minimum benefit cost ratio, highest net benefits. And I'm trying to be just purely descriptive throughout this presentation and not give my own opinion, but I couldn't resist on this one. That maximizing net benefits it's really the obvious clear winner from an economic public policy standpoint. That's just sort of public policy 101. You can fall into a benefit cost ratio trap that leads to suboptimal outcomes. So I encourage states and RSCs and transmission providers to use their discretion to find the highest net benefits as their selection criteria. Next slide. So where do we fit in the timeline? So Order 1920 was issued. I might note that it was issued after 3.5 years, or I guess 3 years of process. Former Chairman Glick mentioned he started it in the middle of 2021. So, we're 3.5 years into it already. And by the way, we might not have projects selected until 2030. That's the bolded part down at the bottom, if you just take all the time that anybody wants. So all these requests for additional flexibility can be dangerous if the need is now. But here's where we are. We're kind of in that 2024, 2025. You can see we're right in the middle of a lot of points there. There's the appeal, there's the rehearing request, there's 1920A. And then into next year, regions will be developing their compliance filings. And then, it's not till a couple of years later that the planning cycles actually start. So just to emphasize again that when you put everything on the map, there's actually a lot of time here, and you can, if the need is now, just be mindful of kind of work backward from the end game in terms of project selection, because even after that, you need to do permitting these lines, and that's obviously hard to do. So next slide. So how does the cycle work in terms of getting from the initial inputs to the output? The scenario development, you've heard about the 7 factors. The 7th factor was modified in 1920A, but there are 7 factors and at least 3 plausible and diverse long-term 20 or more year scenarios. So that's kind of inputs. That's where you're throwing in your load growth and your generation additions, retirements, any locational information about the generators and load. You sort of put all that in terms of the initial ingredients in the recipe. Then the state consultation and additional scenarios. States can request a reasonable additional set of scenarios, which might be for the purpose of ultimate project selection. It might also be just for the purpose of cost allocation. Then identification of needs and facilities. So this is where the engineers get more involved. You have the load and generation and the future scenarios, and then where does power want to move on which paths, and then what is a good configuration of a portfolio of plans. Then benefits calculations. These are required, at least the 7 reliability and economic benefits. Most of the standard economic reliability items are in there, but you do want to look. There's I agree with Hannes's perspective. You want a kind of a holistic set of benefits in there that goes well beyond the just sort of traditional production costs, which usually, first of all, it's only one category. Second of all, typically that's done very narrowly to miss some benefits. But then, and then part of this is all to provide transparency. So stakeholders, states, et cetera, will know, hopefully after this process, what are the benefits, what are the costs, and what does the kind of proposed grid look like. And then you go to project selection, and the transmission providers must determine during the process a process for selecting final transmission facilities that maximizes benefits. So, you know, it needs to be clear. Parties need to understand why projects might have been selected or not selected. But again, FERC did not hardwire a particular sort of decision metric in the order for whatever reason. Some of that's legal. I think the more FERC hardwires things, it gets a little dicier. But also, I think just legitimately trying to provide regions with some flexibility. Next slide. All right, so now scenario development using those 7 factors. First of all, you know, it is long-term, at least 20 years. The plausible scenarios that reasonably capture probable future outcomes and diverse scenarios that are distinct from each other, and then at least one sensitivity. And the categories are as listed here to include there was a little change to number 7, I think really just to clarify that no one sort of source of information, no one customer group's procurement is, you know, has more standing than anybody else's. But the point is still that customer demands and interests are still to be accounted for. And then there are some categories can be discounted, others not. There was some new discussion in 1920A about a separate scenario that was suggested that could be for cost allocation purposes. It sort of leaves aside public policies, and it's more focused on reliability and economics to presumably help states agree on who's responsible for what and reach a cost allocation agreement. Next slide. Moving on to the next step, state consultation and additional scenarios. Providers must consult with states on how to account for factors related to state public policies, laws, regulations, such as changing generation resources, but there are lots of different policies, state economic development policies, et cetera, attracting load, so it's load side and generation side. States can also request transmission providers to develop a reasonable number of additional scenarios. And again, this is to assist them with the state's responsibility, the relevant state entities' responsibilities in the planning, the project selection, and the cost allocation. And they don't necessarily need to fit the same requirements as the minimum required factors. Okay, why don't we move to the next slide? Okay, so identification of needs and facilities. Again, this is where the regional planners, the engineers start getting more involved, and you know, look at all the needs and look at where power wants to move, and you know, connect the dots and put paths on maps. So the transmission providers identify both long-term needs and candidate facilities. Again, using the 7 factors. Then providers identify both long-term needs and facilities using the reliability and economic drivers. Order 1920 sort of severed the connection between using the benefits list at this stage and sort of left that for the later stage. But the factors do essentially sort of take into account those benefits, and you know, hopefully people see this as sort of how do you co-optimize, you know, the right amount of transmission, and there's always sort of choices to be made between, you know, super cheap remote generation, but that requires more transmission cost, and perhaps higher cost generation, but that would require less transmission costs. There's sort of a co-optimization inherent in that, a balancing, and this is where that type of analysis comes into play. Transmission providers can still use one or all 7 reliability and economic 1920 benefits to identify these needs and facilities. Okay, next slide. Next step, or 3A, additional requirements for facilities identification. This is where we look at some different options beyond just the standard, new line on a new right-of-way with new towers and equipment, et cetera. So transmission providers, and you've heard this earlier, I think from Amy, are required to look at alternative transmission technologies for each sort of need, and the technologies listed there were specifically called out: types of conductors and DLR, power flow control, transmission switching. And then they're also required to consider right sizing. When they're looking at sort of asset replacements and other things, or just within the plan, looking at the right economies of scale here. Economies of scale are, of course, huge missions. So there are sometimes opportunities when you're doing a long-term plan to really achieve a more efficient long-term scale. So that is now required. Next slide. Now benefits calculation. So again, these 7 are required to be calculated and posted. The intent, I think the stated intent, is to provide stakeholders with information they can use for their own perspective, whether it's the states and the relevant state entity or the transmission providers or other stakeholders, that everybody will have a good sense of what these benefits are. I agree with Hannes, who said there are best practices approach to these. Now, some regions have not been doing most of this, but there are practices developed. Doesn't mean there's any one model. In fact, I think to do this right, you'll necessarily be using different types of models and different platforms. So there is certainly some art as well as the science in integrating information from different modeling platforms and types. But that said, it's not like these things haven't been calculated before. Let's see, on the right side here, I don't think there's much more I need to say there. When quantifying benefits, providers may use a portfolio approach. That was something Hannes also mentioned, but that is, that is a good step. Usually on any given line, you might wind up with sort of more likely to have bigger winners and bigger losers, but when you put the whole portfolio together, those differences kind of get smoothed out, and there's less of a disparity, and everybody sort of gets something from some of the lines. So that is allowed. That portfolio approach is allowed, and is probably a good idea. Next slide. Okay, now we get to project selection. Again, FERC did not hardwire this, but they did give some sort of leanings and hints. So the provider, first of all, must have a process and say in its compliance what that process is, and it should compare the benefits against costs. And then providers must designate a point in the process at which they determine whether or not to select a facility, and parties should be able to know why they did or didn't select certain facilities. The order provided several examples. I mentioned those before. And if it is a benefit cost ratio, there's it can't be higher than the 1.25. I think 1.25 was used in Order 1000 13 years ago. And you can use qualitative factors in the selection process. And transmission providers must consult with states and seek support for the selection process. So again, this is another key area for states to plug in on. It's not just cost allocation. It's this it's this stage as well in terms of what is the process for project selection. And then for selected portfolios, providers must publicly quantify the benefits and costs for each pricing zone. Now that's a change, and that's more granular, more detailed than was before. That is done. If you look at some of the SPP and MISO plans, you can often see benefits and costs by zone. But a lot of RTOs and regional entities have not been doing that by zone. It can be done. It gets, there's art and science when you try to get more granular with, limited resolution modeling. But again, it can be done. Next slide. Well, that's it. I guess I'll turn it back to Juliet, and see if there's questions.
Okay, yeah, we have time for a few questions, so folks feel free to still enter them into the Q&A box. But yeah, Rob, could you clarify a little bit more when you mentioned the highest net benefits as a selection criteria? Can you say a little bit more about that? I can go back to that slide if that'd be helpful.
Sure. I call it kind of a yeah, you can go back to that slide. It's kind of a benefit cost ratio trap. If you think about if you just invested $1 into something and you got $2 of benefit, awesome. You have 2x benefit cost ratio, 200%, 2.0. That sounds like the best investment. But what if you also had an opportunity to invest $1 billion and get $2 billion in benefit? Then you have the same 2.0 ratio, but you've got a $1 billion of net benefit. 2 minus 1 is $1 billion, whereas the first option only gave you $1 of benefit. So is $1 billion something you'd rather have than $1? Of course it is. So that's why, you look in any economics textbook or public policy textbook, and I know this because my father wrote one of them. That's the clear decision rule one should choose if they were just going based on economics.
And so when it comes to, can you bring that back to the FERC Order 1920 and the state's perspective?
Yeah, so FERC does require, the calculation of benefits and costs. So everybody will have information about the benefits and the costs of different options. And there's strong language indicating maximizing net benefits is sort of the preferred way to go, but it's not required. And, a benefit cost ratio is allowed. But I think FERC was just trying to not hardwire that and not be too micromanagey here, and leave decisions for regions and the states in those regions. So it is something now that states should think about, since they have an explicit role. The relevant state entity has an explicit role in the selection criteria. So think about, if you're getting involved in that for your relevant state entity in your region, if you start thinking about selection criteria, think about whether you want to kind of take the hint and go for maximizing net benefits, or, if you hear something else, then think it through, I guess, in terms of what's really in the long-term interests of your state.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. And then relative to the timing that you put forward for actually getting projects built using the FERC Order 1920 process, it stretches out quite a bit. And if some of the folks from states who are on the call are interested in things moving more quickly than that, which I'm sure a lot of folks are, any suggestions for how they would navigate that within the 1920 process or outside of it? What suggestions would you have for folks who want to go faster than that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would encourage every region to encourage their engineers to get busy planning scenarios like yesterday, because we know that's going to have to be done. We also know that there will be, policy calls that are made in the simultaneous processes going on benefits, methods, and project selection and cost allocation. Like, all those things need to be hammered out, the ex ante cost allocation. So fine, be doing that, but we don't want to get to a point where it's 2029 and the engineers haven't started their work yet. They could have been started at the end of 2024, And then all that work is ready to go. And maybe they choose cost allocation option A, B, or C for that region, but they don't have to wait, another 4 years to see how it's going to turn out or to get busy on the transmission, especially because of power demand growth. We just put out a new update of our national load forecast report, and it's on our Grid Strategies website, and it's looking like 3% per year when we're all used to 0.5% per year for the last 2.5 decades. So it's a lot, regardless of any climate, clean energy, other things affecting the system. I think there are a lot of ways that the engineers can start getting busy with input assumptions on demand growth, generation retirements, generation additions, and thinking about configuration and, is there a HVDC option in this region or, kind of grid configuration thing. So that's what I would encourage is support for moving forward on the analysis. And then, of course, policy calls will have to be made about, who pays or which projects are ultimately selected and things like that. But don't hold up that important and, difficult and detailed work that needs to happen.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Rob. Really appreciate it. Okay, so now we've got a last poll that we want all our participants to take. But before we do that, I want to put one more plug in here for the technical assistance that is being offered. And this is a QR code for that. And there's a link here where you can go to the website. And there's different types of technical assistance that DOE and the labs can provide. There's deeper dive technical assistance, and there's an application period that closes on December 31st for that. But if you just want to talk to some folks to see about what the options are and how your state might benefit, feel free to put an application in for one of these help desk technical assistance where it's just a few hours where we can work with you. And stay tuned for additional webinars and events. And also want to thank GDO and NARUC and NASIO and all of our presenters and panelists and Lisa Schwartz for also helping. Really appreciate this. This has been a great webinar. So Jessica, do you want to go ahead and launch that final poll? We just want to get a little bit more feedback from our participants here before we close. Great. So 2 yes/no questions and then 1 open response question, but I'd love to hear if you'd be potentially interested in individual state technical assistance. And then we're also looking at peer sharing or technical assistance on more of a cohorts. And so we'd like to hear from you if that would be something that would be potentially of interest to have a peer sharing or cohort technical assistance that the labs could help facilitate. And then lastly, we were really pleased with this webinar. We'd love to offer more education for you. So what topic or topics would you like to learn more about in a future training? So if you could just take a minute and answer those, it'd be much appreciated. And we will be sending out the slides and we will have a video posted. And so we'll keep you posted on when those are available. So I'll just give folks another minute here on this. All right. Well, folks I guess they can still participate in that, but we'll go ahead and wrap that up for now. You can always reach out to me as well and others who presented if you have more questions. But I think that is it. I think that is it for us today. So again, thanks to everybody who helped with this. And we'll be in touch through email with the slides and links. And we're happy to hear from you. Otherwise, if you want to send us an email. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to the presenters and panelists. Have a great day and a great weekend.